Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 1, Chapter 21. Turkey and the Balkans. Now mark me well, it is provided in the essence of things that from any fruition of success, no matter what, shall come forth something to make a greater struggle necessary. By Walt Whitman, The Open Road. It is now necessary to describe the circumstances attending the entry of Turkey into the war. In Turkey, as in Greece and all the Balkan states except Serbia, there were two violently conflicting parties, pro-German and pro-Entente. The assiduous courting of Turkey by Germany and the condonation of her most atrocious actions had given the Germans great advantages at Constantinople. In addition, the profound instinct of the Turk was to be on the opposite side to his historic and tremendous enemy, Russia. Britain, on the other hand, took no trouble to counteract these formidable tendencies. Large sections of the British press and public denounced the Turk, often with justice, in unmeasured terms, and no foreign policy based on special relations with Turkey could have stood for a day in a liberal House of Commons. Notwithstanding all this, British influence in Turkey rested on foundations so deep and ancient, and the impression produced upon the Turkish mind by her obviously disinterested course of action was so strong that at any rate up till the beginning of 1914 she would have welcomed a British alliance. This was the wish not only of the old Turks, but of the young Turks. When in the summer of 1909 I had visited Constantinople, I made the acquaintance of the young Turk leader and passed several days in the company of Javid, Talat and Halil. I also met at the German manoeuvres of 1910 Enver Pasha, with whom I established amicable relations. All these men seemed animated by a sincere desire to help their country to reform and revive, and I could not help feeling much sympathy for them in their difficulties. In 1911, after Turkey had been attacked by Italy and her Tripoli province seized, I received the following letter from Javid Bey, written on behalf of his friends on the then all-powerful Committee of Union and Progress. Javid Bey to Mr. Churchill, October 29, 1911. My belief in your sincere friendship for Turkey and the Young Turks leads me to speak of a very important matter today. After the Constitution in Turkey, those that believed in the beginning of a close friendship between England and Turkey saw with regret the misunderstanding that prevented it. I need not speak of its different causes here. Only the true friends of England in Turkey never ceased from trying to remove it. The actual circumstances appear to be a good occasion for success. The attack of one of the Triple Alliance's powers on our territory has turned the public opinion greatly against the Triplice. The pro-English statesmen in Turkey and pro-Turkish statesmen in England could profit of this occasion. Knowing and believing you to occupy an important and influential position among our friends in England, I will beg you to join our efforts using your influence in bringing out this friendship. Has the time arrived for a permanent alliance between the two countries? On what basis could it be attempted? Will you please write me your personal views on the matter? They will be considered entirely personal and unofficial. But I will consider myself happy if we can prepare a possible ground for official purposes. I commanded this matter promptly to Sir Edward Grey, but the danger of estranging Italy, apart from domestic and political considerations, made it impossible for him to authorize me to say more than the following. Mr. Churchill to Javid Bey, Admiralty, November 19, 1911. It is a great pleasure to me to receive your letter, the importance of which I fully recognize. So far as the present lamentable struggle is concerned, we have definitely declared our neutrality, and it is not to be expected that we shall alter a policy so gravely decided. My answer, therefore, to your question must be that at the present time we cannot enter upon new political relations. In the future, the enormous interests which unite the two great Mussulman powers should keep us in touch. That is our wish. The feeling of British public opinion, as you will have seen from recent manifestations of it, opposes no barrier to that wish, if only the Turkish government will not alienate it by reverting to the oppressive methods of the old regime or seeking to disturb the British status quo as it now exists. And you and your friends, whom I remember to have met with so much pleasure, should bear in mind that England, almost alone among European states, seeks no territorial expansion, and that alone among them she retains the supremacy of the sea. We earnestly desire to revive and maintain our old friendship with Turkey, which, while we retain that supremacy, should be a friendship of value. I must apologize for the delay in answering your letter, which was due to the importance of its nature. In the years which followed, the Young Turks looked towards Germany, and here they were very powerfully swayed by their military instincts and training. They rightly regarded Germany as the leading military power. Many of them had received their military education in Berlin, and they were spellbound by the splendor and authority of Prussian organization. They saw the Russian giant ever growing to the east and to the north. And if England stood aloof, where else could Turkey find protection except through the German sword? I do not see what else we could have expected. Therefore, from the very beginning of the war, I hoped for nothing from Turkey and apprehended much. The Ottoman Empire was in 1914 already moribund. Italy, using sea power, had invaded and annexed Tripoli in 1909. And a desultory warfare was still proceeding in the interior of this province, when the Balkan states in 1912 drew the sword upon their ancient conqueror and tyrant. Important provinces and many islands were ceded by the defeated Turkish Empire in the Treaty of London, and the division of the spoils became a new cause of bloodshed among the Balkan victors. Rich prizes still remained in European Turkey to attempt the ambition or satisfy the claims of Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece. And through all, Constantinople glittered as the supreme goal. But imminent as were the dangers of the Turkish Empire from the vengeance and ambition of the Balkan states, nothing could supplant in the Turkish mind the fear of Russia. Russia was in contact with Turkey by land and water along a 1,000-mile frontier which stretched from the western shores of the Black Sea to the Caspian. England, France, and Italy, with Sardinia in the Crimean War, the exceptional power of England under Disraeli in 1878, had preserved the Turkish Empire from ruin and Constantinople from conquest. Although before the Balkan allies quarreled among themselves, the Bulgarians had marched to the gates of Constantinople from the west. The sense of peril from the north still outweighed all else in Turkish thoughts. To this was added the antagonism of the Arab race in the Yemen, the Hejaz, Palestine, Syria, Mosul, and Iraq. The population of Kurdistan and the widely distributed Armenian race were estranged. From every quarter the nations and races who for 500 or 600 years had waged war against the Turkish Empire or had suffered the fate of Turkish captives turned their gaze in a measureless hatred and hunger upon the dying empire from which they had endured so much so long. The hour of retribution and restoration was at hand, and the only doubt was how long could the busily spun webs of European diplomacy, and particularly of English diplomacy, postpone the final reckoning. The imminent collapse of the Turkish Empire, like the progressive decay and disruption of the Austrian Empire arising from forces beyond human control, had loosened the whole foundations of Eastern and Southeastern Europe. Change, violent, vast, incalculable, but irresistible and near, brooded over the hearths and institutions of 120 millions of people. It was at this hour and on this scene that Germany had launched her army to the invasion of France through Belgium, and all other quarrels had realigned themselves in accordance with the supreme struggle. What was to happen to scandalous, crumbling, decrepit and penniless Turkey in this earthquake? She received what seemed to British eyes the most favorable offer ever made to any government in history. She was guaranteed at the price merely of maintaining her neutrality the absolute integrity of all her dominions. She was guaranteed this upon the authority not only of her friends France and Britain, but on that of her enemy Russia. The guarantee of France and England would have protected Turkey from the Balkan states, and especially Greece. The guarantee of Russia suspended to indefinite periods the overhanging menace from the north. The influence of Britain could largely allay and certainly postpone the long-rising movement of the Arabs. Never, thought the Allies, was a fairer proposition made to a weaker and more imperiled state. But there was another side to the picture. Within the decaying fabric of the Turkish Empire and beneath the surface of its political affairs lay fierce, purposeful forces both in men and ideas. The disaster of the First Balkan War created from these elements a concealed, slow-burning fire of strange intensity, unrealized by all the embassies along the shores of the Bosphorus. All save one. During this time, the years before the Great War, wrote a profoundly informed Turk in 1915, the whole future of the Turkish people was examined by committees down to the smallest details. Footnote: from The Turkish and Pan-Turkish Ideals by Tekin Alp, first published in German in 1915. End of footnote. The Pan-Turk Committee accepted the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 as a definite alliance between the power who had been Turkey's strongest and most disinterested supporter and friend with the power who was her ancient and inexorable enemy. They therefore looked elsewhere for help in the general European war, which they were convinced was approaching. Their plan, which seemed in 1913 merely visionary, was based upon the recreation of Turkey on a solely Turkish human foundation, to wit, the Turkish peasantry of Anatolia. It contemplated as a national ideal the uniting of the Muslim areas of Caucasia, the Persian province of Azerbaijan, and the Turkish Transcaspian provinces of Russia, the homeland of the Turkish race, with the Turks of the Anatolian Peninsula, and the extension of Turkey into the Caspian Basin. It included the rejection of theocratic government, a radical change of relationship between church and state, the diversion of the pious foundations, endowments to the secular needs of the state, and a rigorous disciplining of the professional religious classes. It included also the startling economic, social, and literary changes which have recently been achieved in Turkey. Mustafa Kemal has in fact executed a plan decided upon and to which he may well have been a party 15 years ago. The center point of all the Pan-Turk schemes was the use of Germany to rid Turkey of the Russian danger. Marschall von Bieberstein, for so many years German ambassador at Constantinople, nursed these hidden fires with skillful hands. Pan-Turkish schemes might have remained in dreamland but for the fact that in a fateful hour there stood almost at the head of Turkey a man of action, a would-be Turkish Napoleon, in whose veins surged warrior blood. By his individual will, vanity and fraud was destined to launch the Turkish Empire upon its most audacious adventure. Enver, the German-trained but Turkish-hearted subaltern, had thrown his cap over the fence, to quote himself, as the signal for the Young Turk Revolution in 1909. Together with his handful of Young Turk friends forming the Committee of Union and Progress, he had bravely faced all the gathering foes. When Italy had seized Tripoli, it was in the deserts of Tripoli that Enver had fought. When the armies of Balkan allies were at the lines of Chartalia, it was Enver who had never despaired. Adrianople, said Mr. Asquith, then Prime Minister in 1912, will never be restored to Turkey. But Enver entered Adrianople within a month, and Adrianople is Turkish today. The outbreak of the Great War saw Enver with his associate, Talat, and his skillful and incorruptible finance minister, Javid, in control of Turkish affairs. Above them, an imposing facade, were the Sultan and the Grand Vizier. But these men and their adherents were the unquestioned governing power, and of them Enver in all action was the explosive force. The Turkish leaders rated the might of Russia for the rough and tumble of a general war far lower than did the Western allies of the Tsar. They were convinced that the Germanic group would win in the war on land, that Russia would be severely mauled, and that a revolution would follow. Turkey would secure, in the moment of a German victory, gains in territory and population in the Caucasus, which would at least ward off the Russian danger for several generations. In the long preliminary discussions, Germany promised Turkey territorial satisfaction in the Caucasus, in the event of a victory by the Central Powers. This promise was decisive upon Turkish policy. The policy of the Pan-Turks in every sphere of Turkish life and their territorial ambitions were embodied in a definite war plan. This plan required, as its foundation, the Turkish command of the Black Sea. Whenever the Great War should come, as come they were sure it must, and Russia was at grips with Germany and Austria, the Pan-Turks intended to invade and conquer the Caucasus. The control of the sea route from Constantinople to Trebizond was indispensable to an advance from Trebizond to Erzurum. Hence, Turkey must have a navy. Popular subscriptions opened in 1911 and 1912 throughout Anatolia, and even throughout Islam, provided the money for the building for Turkey in Great Britain of 2 dreadnoughts. The arrival of one, at least, of these battleships at Constantinople was the peg upon which the whole Turkish war plan hung. The supreme question in July 1914 among the Turkish leaders was, would the ships arrive in time? Obviously, the margin was small. The first Turkish dreadnought, the Reshadi, was due for completion in July, the second a few weeks later. Already, Turkish agents in Russian territory round Olti, Ardahan and Kars were busy arranging for the hoarding of corn crops for the Muslim Turkish peasantry who formed the bulk of the population, in order to make possible the advance of the Turkish columns down the valley of the Choruk and against the Russian rear. On July 27, a secret defensive and offensive alliance between Germany and Turkey against Russia was proposed by Turkey, accepted forthwith by Germany, and signed on August 2. The mobilization of the Turkish army was ordered on July 31. But now came a surprise. England suddenly assumed an attitude of definite resistance to Germany. The British fleets had put to sea in battle order. On July 28, I requisitioned both the Turkish dreadnoughts for the Royal Navy. I took this action solely for British naval purposes. The addition of the 2 Turkish dreadnoughts to the British fleet seemed vital to national safety. No one in the Admiralty, nor so far as I know in England, had any knowledge of the Turkish designs or of the part these ships were to play in them. We builded better than we knew. I was later in the year criticized in some quarters for having requisitioned the Turkish ships. The rage and disappointment excited thereby throughout Turkey was said to have turned the scale and provoked Turkey into war against us. We now know the inner explanation of this disappointment. The requisitioning of these ships, so far from making Turkey an enemy, nearly made her an ally. I did my best, with the approval of the cabinet, to allay the legitimate heart-burnings of the Turkish Ministry of Marine. These efforts were seconded by Admiral Limpus, the head of the British naval mission to Turkey, whose relations with the Turks were extremely good and whose mission had won much esteem. But there still remained to the Turks one hope: the Goeben. This fast German battlecruiser was, as has been described in the Western Mediterranean, under peacetime orders to refit at Pola in the Adriatic. She was in herself sufficient to dominate the Russian squadron in the Black Sea. Would the Germans send the Goeben back to Constantinople? Would she get there? It was at this moment that the news of the British ultimatum to Germany, carrying with it the certainty of the British declaration of war, reached Constantinople. The Turkish realists had never counted on such an event. It transformed the naval situation in the Mediterranean. Could the Goeben escape the numerous British flotillas and cruiser squadrons, and the 3 more powerful, though less speedy British battlecruisers which lay between her and the sea? When, on the night of August 3, Enver learned that the Goeben was under orders to escape up the Adriatic to Pola, his anxiety knew no bounds. He immediately sought the Russian military attaché, General Leontev, and casting all previous schemes to the wind, including the agreement he had signed with Germany the day before, proposed to this astonished officer an alliance between Turkey and Russia on various conditions, including Turkish compensations in western Thrace. Whether the Germans realized that they would never be forgiven by the Pan-Turks unless the Goeben made an effort to reach Constantinople, or whether it was already part of their war plan, fresh orders to get to Constantinople were at this moment, August 3, being sent by Admiral Tirpitz to the Goeben, then about to coal at Messina. And after events which are well known, she reached the Dardanelles about 5 o'clock on the afternoon of August 10, and was after some parley admitted to the Sea of Marmora. The following minutes tell their own tale. To Sir Edward Grey, August 12, 1914, Goeben and Breslau. In all the circumstances, the Admiralty agree that the sale or transfer of these 2 vessels to the Turkish flag should be allowed, provided that the transference is bona fide and permanent. The essential condition to insist on is that all the German officers and men of the crews of both ships must, without exception, be at once repatriated to Germany under parole, not to serve again during the war. We cannot agree to any exceptions being made, whether of officers or skilled ratings, or of the ordinary crew. The British Embassy, assisted if necessary by the English naval mission, should assure themselves that all the Germans leave at once, and that the ships are definitely handed over to the Turkish Navy. In these circumstances, the Admiralty would allow the British naval mission to remain as requested by the Grand Vizier. The Turks could also be informed that after the war is over, we should be quite ready in principle, and as far as we can now foresee, to transfer one or both of the 2 ships we have requisitioned to their flag. and that we are quite ready to negotiate with them at the present time in regard to payment of the sums due to Turkey. Winston S. Churchill. To Sir Edward Grey, August 17, 1914. The situation about Goeben and Breslau is extremely unsatisfactory. Their sale to Turkey is probably itself a breach of neutrality. The vital condition of the repatriation of the German complements down to the last man has not taken place. Probably the whole of the German crews are still on board, and it is admitted that experts are to be retained. Meanwhile, the British naval mission has been banished from the Turkish ships committed to their charge and forbidden to go on board the two ex-Germans. As long as the Goeben and Breslau remain in this condition, and until we know that the whole of the German crews are definitely repatriated, we have to keep two British battle cruisers, which are urgently needed elsewhere, waiting with other vessels outside the Dardanelles. This is a situation which cannot continue indefinitely. Winston S. Churchill. Enver's confidence was now restored, for the command of the Black Sea rested potentially with the Turks. But the certain hostility of Great Britain was serious, in view of her naval supremacy and the undefended conditions of the Dardanelles. Moreover, Italy had unexpectedly separated herself from the Triple Alliance. It might therefore perhaps be prudent for Turkey to see how the impending great battles on land, and especially those upon the Russian front, were decided. Meanwhile, the mobilization of the Turkish army could proceed unostentatiously and be justified as a precautionary measure. Thus there followed a period of lasting for about 3 months of Turkish hesitation and delay, having the effect of consummate duplicity. I can recall no great sphere of policy about which the British government was less completely informed than the Turkish. It is strange to read the telegrams we received through all channels from Constantinople during this period in the light of our present knowledge. But all the Allies, now encouraged by the friendly assurances of the Grand Vizier and the respectable Effet section of the cabinet, now indignant at the refusal to intern and disarm the Goeben, and generally mystified by many contradictory voices, believed that Turkey had no policy and might still be won or lost. This period was ended when Enver, in November, acting as the agent of all the pan-Turk forces, delivered the unprovoked attack by the Goeben and the Turkish fleet upon the Russian Black Sea ports, and thus plunged Turkey brutally into the war. The Turkish position could only be judged in relation to the general situation in the Balkans, and this could not be understood unless the dominant facts of pre-war Balkan history were continually borne in mind. The First Balkan War saw Bulgaria triumphantly bearing the brunt of the attack on Turkey. While her armies were advancing on Constantinople against the best troops of the Turkish Empire, the Greeks and Serbians were overrunning the comparatively weakly held regions of Thrace and Macedonia. The Bulgarians, having fought the greatest battles and sustained by far the heaviest losses, found themselves finally checked before Constantinople, and, turning round, beheld almost the whole of the conquered territory in the hands of their allies. The destination of this territory had been regulated before the war by treaty between the 4 belligerent minor states. Adrianople had not, however, surrendered, and in obedience to the treaty the Serbians came to the aid of the Bulgarian forces, and played a prominent part in the capture of that fortress. Both the Serbians and the Greeks utilized the argument that the war had been prolonged through the need of reducing Adrianople as a ground for claiming to repudiate in important particulars the pre-war treaty, and meanwhile they retained occupation of all the conquered districts in their possession. The Bulgarians were quick to repay this claim with violence. They attacked the Greeks and Serbians, were defeated by the more numerous armies of these two powers, and in the moment of extreme weakness and defeat were invaded from the other side by Romania, who, having taken no part in the conflict, had intact armies to strike with. At the same time, the Turks advanced in Thrace, and led by Enver Pasha, recaptured Adrianople. Thus the end of the Second Balkan War saw Bulgaria stripped not only of almost all her share of the territory conquered from the Turks, and this entirely divided between Greece and Serbia, but even her native province of the Dobruja had been wrested from her by Romania. The terrible cruelties and atrocities which had been perpetrated on both sides in the internecine struggle that followed the expulsion of the Turks had left a river of blood between the Greeks and Serbians on the one hand and the Bulgarians on the other. It is possible that no nation ever contemplated its fortunes with more profound and desperate resolve than the Bulgarians at this juncture. All their sacrifices had been useless, and worse than useless. All the fruits of their conquests had gone to aggrandize their rivals. They had been, as they considered, stabbed in the back and blackmailed by Romania, to whom they had given no provocation of any kind. They saw the great powers, England in the van, forbid the return of the Turk to Adrianople without offering the slightest attempt to make their words good. They saw not only Salonika, but even Kavala seized by the Greeks. They saw large districts inhabited largely by the Bulgarian race, newly liberated from the Turks, pass under the yoke, to them scarcely less odious, of Serbians and Greeks. It was in these circumstances that the Bulgarian army, in the word of King Ferdinand, furled its standards and retired to wait for better days. This warlike and powerful Bulgaria, with its scheming king and its valiant peasant armies, brooding over what seemed to them intolerable wrongs, was the dominant factor in the Balkans in 1914 and 15. On August 19, 1914, Monsieur Venizelos, then Prime Minister of Greece, with the approval which he had, astonishing to relate, obtained of King Constantine, formally placed at the disposal of the Entente Powers all the naval and military resources of Greece from the moment when they might be required. He added that this offer was made in a special sense to Great Britain, with whose interests those of Greece were indissolubly bound. The resources of Greece, he said, were small, but she could dispose of 250,000 troops, and her navy and her ports might be of some use. This magnanimous offer, made as it was while all was so uncertain, and even before the main battle in France had been joined, greatly attracted me. No doubt, on the one hand, it was a serious thing to run the risk of adding Turkey to our enemies. On the other hand, the Greek army and navy were solid factors, and a combination of the Greek armies and fleet with the British Mediterranean squadron offered a means of settling the difficulties of the Dardanelles in a most prompt and effective manner. The Gallipoli Peninsula was then only weakly occupied by Turkish troops, and the Greek General Staff were known to be ready with well-thought-out plans for its seizure. Moreover, it seemed to me that anyhow Turkey was drifting into war with us. Her conduct in regard to the Goeben and Breslau continued openly fraudulent. The presence of these two vessels themselves in German hands in the Sea of Marmora offered a means of putting decisive pressure on the neutrality party in Constantinople. If we were not going to secure honest Turkish neutrality, then let us, in the alternative, get the Christian states of the Balkans on our side. Could we not get them on our side? Could we not make a Balkan confederation of Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania? Whatever happened, we ought not to fall between two stools. Sir Edward Grey, however, after very anxious consideration, moved the cabinet to decline Monsieur Venizelos's proposal, as he feared, no doubt with weighty reasons, that an alliance with Greece meant immediate war with Turkey and possibly Bulgaria. He feared that it might jeopardize Greece without our being able to protect her. He was anxious above all things not to foster a Greek enterprise against Constantinople in such a way as to give offense to Russia. And lastly, he hoped that Sir Louis Mallet, who was in close and intimate relations with the Grand Vizier and the leaders of the Turkish neutrality party in Constantinople, would after all be able to keep the peace. Certainly nothing could exceed the skill and perseverance with which the British ambassador labored. It followed from this that we should maintain the very handsome offer we had made in common with France and Russia at the outbreak of the war to guarantee the integrity of the Turkish Empire in return for her faithful neutrality. I naturally conformed to the cabinet decision, but with increasing misgivings. I still continued to work and hope for a Balkan confederation. I gave the following letter, of which the Foreign Secretary approved, to Mr. Noel Buxton, who was starting for a propaganda tour in the Balkans. Of course, in view of our decision about Turkey, it could refer only to the common interests of these states against Austria. August 13, 1914. It is of the utmost importance to the future prosperity of the Balkan states that they should act together. This is the hour when the metal can be cast into the mold. It is only by reclaiming from Austria territories which belong naturally to the Balkan races that the means can be provided to satisfy the legitimate needs and aspirations of all the Balkan states. Without taking Austrian territory, there is no way by which any Balkan state can expand except by internecine war. But the application of the principle of nationality to the southern provinces of Austria will produce results so advantageous to the Balkan states that the memory and the consequences of former quarrels could be assuaged forever. The creation of a Balkan confederation comprising Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, Montenegro, and Greece, strong enough to play an effective part in the destinies of Europe, must be the common dream of all their peoples. The result of this war is not doubtful. Sooner or later, Germany will be starved and beaten. Austria will be resolved into its component parts. England has always won in the end, and Russia is unconquerable. England has been the friend of every Christian state in the Balkans during all their years of struggle and suffering. She has no interests of her own to seek in the Balkan Peninsula. But with her wealth and power she will promote and aid every step which is taken to build up a strong union of the Christian peoples, like that which triumphed in the First Balkan War. By acting together in unity and good faith, the Balkan states can now play a decisive part and gain advantages which may never again be offered. By disunion, they will simply condemn themselves to tear each other's throats without profit or reward, and left to themselves will play an utterly futile part in the destinies of the world. I want you to make your friends in Greece and in Bulgaria realize the brilliant but fleeting opportunity which now presents itself, and to assure them that England's might and perseverance will not be withheld from any righteous effort to secure the strength and union of the Balkan peoples. In the early days of September, it seemed highly probable that Turkey, under the influence of the German advance on Paris, would make war upon us and upon Greece, whatever we did. I began immediately to prepare for the event. Mr. Churchill to General Sir Charles Douglas, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, September 1, 1914. Secret. I arranged with Lord Kitchener yesterday that 2 officers from Admiralty should meet 2 officers from the Director of Military Operations Department of the War Office today to examine and work out a plan for the seizure by means of a Greek army of adequate strength of the Gallipoli Peninsula, with a view to admitting a British fleet to the Sea of Marmora. In his absence, I would ask you to give the necessary directions, as the matter is urgent, and Turkey may make war on us at any moment. The meeting can take place either here or at the War Office as soon as you can arrange with our Chief of Staff. I will myself explain verbally to the committee the subject on which His Majesty's Government desire information. The Director of Military Operations, General Caldwell, replied on the 3rd, on behalf of the General Staff, that the operation of seizing the Gallipoli Peninsula would be an extremely difficult one. 60,000 men would be required, 30,000 of whom should be landed in the first instance, should gain as much ground as possible, should prepare landing stages, and hold their own for a week, while the transports returned to Greece for the second 30,000. On this basis, the operation was considered feasible. These estimates were not excessive, and the Greeks could certainly provide a considerably larger force if necessary. Thereupon I telegraphed, with the approval of the Foreign Office, to Rear Admiral Mark Kerr, the head of our naval mission to Greece, as follows. September 4. In event of war with Turkey, with England and Greece as allies, Admiralty consider it essential, as a staff precaution, that the question of the right war policy to be followed should be examined in consultation with Greek general and naval staff, leaving political probabilities to be decided by respective governments. Admiralty give you permission to do this, should you be approached by the Greek government. In principle, the Admiralty views are as follows. In order to provide unquestionable and decisive superiority over the German and Turkish vessels, the Greek fleet would be offered, as reinforcements, a squadron and flotilla, and the whole of the combined fleets would be placed under your command, with the Indomitable as your flagship. Should circumstances demand it, it would be reinforced with any class of vessel necessary and to any extent. In order that the right and obvious method of attack upon Turkey, that is, by striking immediately at the heart, may be carried out, the Greek army would, under superiority of sea predominance, have to seize the Gallipoli Peninsula, thus opening the Dardanelles and enabling the Anglo-Greek fleet in the Sea of Marmora to fight and sink the Turco-German ships, and from there the whole situation can be dominated in combination with the Black Sea fleet of the Russians and their military forces. The Admiralty desire that, in consultation with you, the Greek naval and military experts should immediately examine this enterprise, and that you should report fully by telegraph to the Admiralty what are the general views of the Greek government upon it, and what, in their opinion, would be the force required to carry it out, assuming that safe transportation is assured. Should we provide the necessary transports, or in what time and to what extent could Greece do so? Have they any alternative suggestions? The Rear Admiral's reply reached me through the Foreign Office on the 9th. The Greek General Staff have been consulted on the subject of your telegram, and I agree with them in their opinion that, if Bulgaria does not attack Greece, the latter can take Gallipoli with force at their disposal. Greece will not trust Bulgaria unless she at the same time attacks Turkey with all her force. They will not accept Bulgaria's guarantee to remain neutral. Subject to above conditions, plan for taking Dardanelles Straits is ready. Greece can provide necessary transports for troops. A British squadron of 2 battle cruisers, 1 armored cruiser, 3 light cruisers and flotilla of destroyers will be needed to assist. General Staff and myself originally formulated this plan, but operation has become greater since Turkey has mobilized and obtained German ships. He mentioned as an alternative the region of Alexandretta. On September 6, Monsieur Venizelos told our minister in Athens that he was not afraid of a single-handed attack from Turkey by land, as the Greek General Staff were confident of being able to deal with it. The Greek government had received from Sofia positive assurances of definite neutrality, but did not trust them. They would, however, be satisfied with a formal protest by the Bulgarian government against a violation of Bulgarian territory by Turkish troops proceeding to attack Greece. If, however, Bulgaria joined Turkey while Serbia was occupied with Austria, the situation would be critical. On this I pointed out to the Foreign Secretary on the same date that a Russian army corps could easily be brought from Archangel, from Vladivostok, or, with Japanese consent, from Port Arthur to attack the Gallipoli Peninsula. The price to be paid in taking Gallipoli would no doubt be heavy, but there would be no more war with Turkey. A good army of 50,000 men and sea power, that is the end of the Turkish menace. But it was easier to look for armies than to find them. Sir Edward Grey replied by sending me a telegram that had been received that very morning from Petrograd, stating that in view of the very large number of German troops which were being transferred from the Western to the Eastern theatre, Russia will calling up every available man from Asia and the Caucasus, and was only leaving 1 army corps in the latter. Greece would therefore, according to the Petrograd telegram, have to bear the brunt of the war single-handed unless she could placate Bulgaria by territorial concessions. He added on the back of my note, "You will see from the telegram from St. Petersburg that Russia can give no help against Turkey. I do not like the prospect in the Mediterranean at all, unless there is some turn of the tide in France." It is only by faithful study of this problem that its immense difficulties are portrayed. Lest it should be thought that I underrated the gravity of a war with Turkey, it must be remembered that I had convinced myself that Turkey would attack us sooner or later, and that I was also proceeding on the belief that the German invasion of France would be brought to a standstill. Both these assumptions proved true. I do not claim that my views was the wisest, but only to expose it to historical judgment. The policy emerging from such a view would of course at this juncture have offered Cyprus to Greece in compensation for her offering Kavala to Bulgaria. It would have put the most extreme pressure on Serbia to make concessions to Bulgaria in Monastir. Whether these measures would have succeeded at this time, I do not pronounce. By September 9, the behavior of the Turks about the Goeben and the Breslau had become so openly defiant that it became necessary to withdraw the British naval mission, who were exposed to daily insolences at the hands of the Germans and of the Turkish war party. It was my intention to appoint the head of the mission, Rear Admiral Limpus, to command the squadron watching the Dardanelles, and orders were sent definitely to that effect. This project was not, however, pursued, it being thought that it would be unduly provocative to employ on this station the very officer who had just ceased to be the teacher of the Turkish fleet. No doubt this was a weighty argument, but in bowing to it we lost the advantages of having at this fateful spot the admiral who of all others knew the Turks and knew the Dardanelles with all its possibilities. It was a small link in a long chain. Delay was caused, and I had to make fresh arrangements. On September 21 I telegraphed to Vice Admiral Carden, who was in charge of the Malta dockyard. Assume command of the squadron of Dardanelles. Your sole duty is to sink Goeben and Breslau, no matter what flag they fly, if they come out of Dardanelles. We are not at war with Turkey, but the German Admiral Souchon is now Commander-in-Chief Turkish Navy, and Germans are controlling and largely manning it. Turks have been told that any Turkish ships which come out with Goeben and Breslau will be equally attacked by us. You are authorized to act accordingly without further declaration or parley. You must deal at your discretion with any minor Turkish war vessel which may come out alone from Dardanelles, either ordering her back or allowing her to proceed as you may think fit, remembering that we do not want to pick a quarrel with Turkey unless her hostile intention is clear. Indomitable will be diverted from convoy of Crete and ordered to join your squadron. French Commander-in-Chief has been requested to send 2 battleships of Patrie class to reinforce your flag. The victory of the Marne, although afterwards discounted by adverse events, checked the developments in the Near East. Turkey was steadied for the moment, and her attitude towards Greece became less menacing. This, however, produced a corresponding cooling at Athens about joining in the European war. From the middle of September, the conditions throughout the Balkans had declined again from crisis to suspense. They remained, however, fundamentally vicious. I continued increasingly to press as opportunity served for a policy of uniting the Balkan states without reference to what might happen in Turkey. On September 23, I wrote to Sir Edward Grey as follows. September 23, 1914. Mr. Churchill to Sir Edward Grey. I must write you a line about Turkey. We are suffering very seriously from Turkish hostility. Our whole Mediterranean fleet is tied to the Dardanelles. We are daily trying to buy Turkish neutrality by promises and concessions. Meanwhile, the German grip on Turkey tightens, and all preparations for war go steadily forward. But all this would in itself be of minor consequence but for the fact that in our attempt to placate Turkey we are crippling our policy in the Balkans. I am not suggesting that we should take aggressive action against Turkey or declare war on her ourselves. But we ought from now to make our arrangements with the Balkan states, particularly Bulgaria, without regard to the interests or integrity of Turkey. The Bulgarians ought to regain the Turkish territory they lost in the Second Balkan War, and we ought to tell them that if they join with Romania, Greece and Serbia in the attack upon Austria and Germany, the Allied powers will see that they get this territory at the peace. We always said that Adrianople should never fall back into Turkish hands, and the strongest possible remonstrances were addressed to the Porte by you at the time. There is therefore nothing wrong or inconsistent in our adopting this position. If we win the war, we shall be quite strong enough to secure this territory for Bulgaria, and Turkey's conduct to us, with repeated breaches of neutrality, would release us from any need of considering her European interests. Like you, I sympathize deeply with Mollit in the futile and thankless task on which he is engaged. I do not know what the result will be, but I am sure it is not worth while sacrificing the bold and decisive alternative of throwing in our lot frankly with the Christian states of the Balkans to get the kind of neutrality which the Turks have been giving us, and for which we are even asked to pay and be grateful. The whole tone of the telegrams from Romania and Bulgaria is hopeful. I do most earnestly beg you not to be diverted from the highway of sound policy in this part of the world, both during the war and at the settlement, by wanderings into the labyrinth of Turkish duplicity and intrigue. All I am asking is that the interests and integrity of Turkey shall no longer be considered by you in any efforts which are made to secure common action among the Christian Balkan states. Judged in afterlight, these views can hardly be contested. I have never swerved from them. But the reader should understand the other arguments by which the cabinet was ruled. The loyal desire not to spread the war to regions still uncursed, the dangers in India of a British quarrel with Turkey, our awful military weakness in 1914, Lord Kitchener's expressed wish to keep the East as quiet as possible till the 2 Indian divisions were safely through the Suez Canal, the difficulties of winning the support of Greece and particularly of King Constantine, without exciting the suspicion and jealousies of Russia about Constantinople, and lastly the doubts, admittedly substantial, whether Bulgaria and King Ferdinand could ever, in the absence of substantial military successes in the main theatres or strong local intervention by Allied forces in the Balkans, be detached from the Teutonic system. When I talked these questions over at the time with Sir Edward Grey, it was upon this last argument that he was most inclined to dwell. Until Bulgaria believes that Germany is not going to win the war, she will not be moved by any promises of other people's territories which we may make her. The swift overrunning of northern France by the German armies, the withdrawal of the French government to Bordeaux, the fall of Antwerp, the tremendous victories of Hindenburg over the Russians, were all events of which dominated the Bulgarian equally with the Turkish mind. England, without an army, with not a soldier to spare, without even a rifle to send, with only her navy and her money, counted for little in the Near East. Russian claims to Constantinople directly crossed the ambitions both of King Ferdinand and of King Constantine. In all the Balkans, only one clairvoyant eye, only the genius of Venizelos, discerned the fundamental moral issues of the struggle, measured justly the relative powers of the mighty combatants, and appraised at their true value both the victories of the German army and the sea power under which were slowly gathering the latent but inexhaustible resources of the British Empire. So the Allies continued to wait and hope at Constantinople, and the days slipped swiftly by. Not till long after did we learn the blasting secret which would have destroyed all British and Russian doubts. Already in the crisis of July, the leaders of the Young Turk Party had been in vital negotiation with the Germans, and on August 2 an alliance had been signed between Germany and Turkey. Thus, all this time we were deceived. Whether anything that was in our power to do could have averted the evils must always remain a disputed question, but that the evils were not averted is certain. In the end, we had all the evils of both courses and the advantages of no course. We were forced into a war with Turkey, which ultimately became of enormous magnitude. Greece was thrown into inextricable confusion. Serbia was overrun. Bulgaria, joining hands with her recent enemies, the Turks, became our foe, and Romania, when she finally came in isolated upon the Allied side, suffered the direst vengeance at German hands. A more fearful series of tragedies has scarcely ever darkened the melancholy page of history. It must not be thought that the action of Turkey was inspired solely by treachery and duplicity. Two parties were struggling for mastery in the capital, but in view of the Treaty of Alliance, which had been signed on August 2, there could have been no doubt about the final outcome. Moreover, in the Goeben and Breslau, to say nothing of the Turkish fleet, Enver Pasha and the war party had the means to force the Turkish government to adhere to the covenants which they had entered into on her behalf. By the middle of October we learned that Turkish preparations to invade Egypt were actually being made. We learned also from a secret source that the Austrian ambassador at Constantinople had received solemn assurances from Enver that Turkey would enter the war against the Entente at an early date. At the end of October, our outposts beyond the Suez Canal had to be withdrawn in face of gathering Turkish forces. And finally, about October 27, the Breslau, with the Turkish cruiser Hamidi and a division of destroyers followed by the Goeben, steamed into the Black Sea, and on the 29th and 30th bombarded the Russian fortress of Sevastopol, sank a Russian transport, raided the harbor of Odessa, torpedoed a gunboat, and lastly practically destroyed Novorossiysk, its oil tanks, and all the shipping in the port. On this, the Russian ambassador at Constantinople immediately demanded his passports, and the British Foreign Office at 8:15 p.m. on October 30, after reciting its many griefs against the Turks, especially their invasion of the Sinai Peninsula and their misconduct about the Goeben, sent an ultimatum requiring repudiation of these acts and the dismissal of the German military and naval missions within 12 hours. The Admiralty conformed to this decision by telegraphing to all admirals concerned as follows. October 31, 1914, 12:35 a.m. Orders sent Ambassador Constantinople 8:15 p.m. October 30 to present ultimatum to Turkey expiring at end of 12 hours. Do not yourself commence hostilities without further orders. Add to Vice Admiral Carden, indefatigable, you may therefore expect embassy to be leaving very shortly. Russia declared war on Turkey at the expiry of the ultimatum, and the British and French ambassadors, in company with their Russian colleague, left Constantinople on November 1, the same day on which, at the other end of the world, the Battle of Coronel was being fought. Naval orders to commence hostilities were sent, in concert with the Foreign Office, in conformity with the expiry of the ultimatum. Admiralty to all ships, October 31, 1914, sent 5:05 p.m. Commence hostilities at once against Turkey. Acknowledge. On November 1, 2 of our destroyers entering the Gulf of Smyrna destroyed a large armed Turkish yacht which was lying by the jetty carrying mines. And late that same day Admiral Carden was instructed to bombard the outer Dardanelles forts at long range on the earliest suitable occasion. This bombardment was carried out on the morning of November 3. The two British battlecruisers, firing from a range beyond that of the Turkish guns, shelled the batteries on the European side at Sed el Bahr and Cape Helles. The French battleships fired at the Asiatic batteries at Kum Kali and Orkani. About 80 rounds were fired altogether, resulting in considerable damage to the Turkish forts, and in several hundred casualties to the Turks and Germans who manned them. The reasons for this demonstration have been greatly canvassed. They were simple, though not important. A British squadron had for months been waiting outside the Dardanelles. War had been declared with Turkey. It was natural that fire should be opened upon the enemy as it would be on the fronts of hostile armies. It was necessary to know accurately the effective ranges of the Turkish guns and the conditions under which the entrance to the blockaded port could be approached. It has been stated that this bombardment was an imprudent act, as it was bound to put the Turks on their guard and lead them to strengthen their defenses. That the organization of the defenses of the Straits should be improved steadily from the declaration of war was inevitable. To what extent this process was stimulated by the bombardment is a matter of conjecture. When 3.5 months later, on February 19, 1915, Admiral Carden again bombarded these same forts, the Gallipoli Peninsula was, however, totally unprepared for defense, and was still weakly occupied, and small parties of marines were able to make their way unopposed into the shattered forts and a considerable distance beyond them. We had now to provide against the impending Turkish attack upon Egypt. The first cruiser squadron, comprising the Black Prince, Duke of Edinburgh, and Warrior, had been either employed on escort duties at sea or on guard at Alexandria or Port Said. Even before the news of Coronel had reached us, the increasing strain upon our resources had made it necessary to replace these fine ships by older, smaller vessels. They were now urgently required to form a combat squadron near the Cape de Verde Islands as part of the second general combination against von Spee. They were also promised to the Commander-in-Chief for the Grand Fleet at the earliest possible moment thereafter. We should have been hard-pressed in these circumstances to find a new and satisfactory naval force for the defense of the canal against the now imminent Turkish attack. The discovery and blocking in of the Königsberg on October 31 liberated 2 out of the 3 vessels searching for her. But this was not enough. The destruction of the Emden on November 9 was an event of a very different order. It afforded us immediate relief, and relief exactly where we required it. The Indian Ocean was now clear. The battleship Swiftsure from the fast Indian station was at once ordered to the canal. Of the fast cruisers that had been searching for the Emden, the Gloucester, Melbourne, Sydney, Hampshire and Yarmouth were immediately brought homewards through the Red Sea into the Mediterranean. I felt that the Commander-in-Chief in the East Indies must come himself to the new scene of danger. Admiralty to Commander-in-Chief East Indies, November 14, 1914. Naval operations in the Red Sea and Egypt cannot be directed from India. Your presence in Egypt is imperative. You should rejoin your flagship Swiftsure at Port Said by the quickest route at once. Gloucester can take you if she has not already sailed. Telegraph what date you expect to arrive at Suez. On arrival, you should consult with General Officer commanding Egypt, and work hand in hand with him and with the British authorities. The following ships will be at your disposal in the Red Sea: Swiftsure, Minerva, Doris, Proserpine, and 8 torpedo boats from Malta. Measures are also being taken to organize armed launches and improvised gunboats for use in the canal. Telegraph whether you feel able to discharge the other duties of your command, namely convoy and Persian Gulf operations, at the same time, or what temporary arrangements you suggest during your absence in Egyptian waters. A few days earlier I had minuted November 18, 1914. to First Sea Lord, Chief of Staff. I cannot agree to this. It would be a great waste of a valuable ship. Considerably more than a week has passed since I minuted that escort should be ordered to the Mediterranean. There, or in Egyptian waters, this Russian ship will have a chance of fighting against Turkey. To send her off to Hong Kong is an altogether purposeless errand. Her stores should go on with the mines or in other vessels which keeps company with the mines from Vladivostok. No convoy is necessary, but if it were, the Clio or Cadmus or some little vessel like them could be used. The whole Japanese navy is in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. They would quite willingly find a convoy for the mines and the escort stores. The whole area of the sea, from the coast of Chile to the coast of Mozambique, has been cleared of the enemy. But for vague rumors of a possible armed merchantman at large, there is not the slightest menace. We must profit from this situation to the full while it lasts, and this can only be done by moving every ship that is of any use promptly into waters where they are required. No one knows how many ships we shall want in Egypt when the Turkish invasion begins. There may also be massacres of Christians in the coast towns of Levant, which will require vessels for immediate action there. All the ships out of the Indian Ocean that can play an effective part ought to be hurried home. The cruisers ought to steam at least 18 knots. Nearly all these ships have lost 3 or 4 precious days since the destruction of the Emden was known. Winston S. Churchill. These directions were complied with. I searched the oceans for every available ship. During the 2nd and 3rd weeks of November, the Swiftsure and the squadron and flotilla mentioned above, together with the French Requin and the Russian escort, entered the canal for the defense of Egypt. The Turkish attack proved, however, to be only of a tentative character. Finding themselves confronted with troops and ships, they withdrew after feeble efforts into the eastern deserts to gather further strength. All this time the great Australasian convoy, carrying the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC, had been steaming steadily towards France across the Pacific and Indian Ocean. Preparations had been made, if necessary, to divert them to Cape Town. But before the convoy reached Colombo, General Botha and General Smuts had suppressed the rebellion in South Africa. The Australians and New Zealanders therefore continued their voyage to Europe under the escort of the Ibuki and the Hampshire. By the end of November their transports were entering the canal. As the Turkish invasion of Egypt was still threatening, the need of resolute and trustworthy troops in Egypt was great, and on the 1st day of December Lord Kitchener, in the fateful unfolding of events, began to disembark the whole Australian and New Zealand force at Suez for the double purpose of completing their training and defending the line of the canal. At this point we may leave the Turkish situation for a time. The German grip was strengthening every day on Turkey. The distresses of her peoples and the improvement of her military organization were advancing together. Under the guns of the Goeben and the Breslau, doubt, division and scarcity dwelt in Constantinople. Outside the straits, the British squadron maintained its silent watch. Greece, perplexed at the attitude of Britain, distracted by the quarrels of Venizelos and King Constantine, had fallen far from the high resolve of August. Serbia stoutly contended with the Austrian armies. Romania and Bulgaria brooded on the past and watched each other with intent regard. In Egypt, the training of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps perfected itself week by week. Thus, as this act in the stupendous world drama comes to its close, we see already the scene being set and the actors assembling for the next. From the uttermost ends of the earth, ships and soldiers are approaching or gathering in the eastern Mediterranean in fulfillment of a destiny as yet not understood by mortal man. The clearance of the Germans from the oceans liberated the fleets. The arrival of the Anzacs in Egypt created the nucleus of the army needed to attack the heart of the Turkish Empire. The deadlock on the Western Front, where all was now frozen into winter trenches, afforded at once a breathing space and large possibilities of further troops. While Australian battalions trampled the crisp sand of the Egyptian desert in tireless evolutions, and Commander Holbrook, in his valiant submarine, dived under the minefields of Charnak and sank a Turkish transport in the throat of the Dardanelles, far away in the basins of Portsmouth, the dockyard men were toiling night and day to mount the 15-inch guns and turrets of the Queen Elizabeth. As yet all was unconscious, inchoate, purposeless, uncombined. Any one of a score of chances might have given, might still give, an entirely different direction to the event. No plan has been made, no resolve taken. But new ideas are astir. New possibilities are coming into view, new forces are at hand, and with them there marches towards us a new peril of the first magnitude. Russia, mighty steamroller, hope of suffering France and prostrate Belgium. Russia is falling. Her armies are grappling with Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and behind their brave battlefronts already the awful signs of weakness, of deficiency, of disorganization are apparent to anxious cabinets and councils. Winter has come and locked all Russia in its grip. No contact with her allies, no help from them is possible. The ice blocks the White Sea. The Germans hold the Baltic. The Turks have barred the Dardanelles. It needs but a cry from Russia for help to make vital what is now void, and to make purposeful what is now meaningless. But as yet no cry has come. I cannot close without taking a more general survey of the naval war. The reader has now followed through 6 chapters the steady increase of strain upon Admiralty resources, which marked in every theatre the months of September, October, and November 1914. He must understand that, although for the purposes of the narrative it is necessary to deal in separate chapters with each separate set of strains and crises, many of the events were proceeding simultaneously in all theatres at once, and the consequent strains were cumulative and reciprocally reacting on one another, with the result that during November an extraordinary pitch of intensity was reached, which could not well be prolonged and could not possibly have been exceeded. It is worthwhile to review the whole situation. First, the transport of troops and supplies to France was unceasing and vital to our army. On the top of all this came the operations on the Belgian coast, the approach of the enemy to the Channel ports, and the long-drawn crisis of the great battle of Ypres Yser. Secondly, all the enemy's cruisers were still alive, and a number of hostile armed merchantmen were free in the outer seas, each threatening an indefinite number of points and areas and requiring from 5 to 10 times their numbers to search for them and protect traffic while they were at large. At the same time, the great convoys of troops from India, from Canada, from Australia, and the collection of the British regular garrisons from all parts of the world were proceeding, and no less than 6 separate expeditions, that is, Samoa, New Guinea, German East Africa, Togoland, the Cameroons, and German Southwest Africa were in progress or at a critical stage. Upon this was thrust the outbreak of war with Turkey, the attack upon the Suez Canal, and the operations in the Persian Gulf. To meet these fierce obligations, we had to draw no less than 3 decisive units from the Grand Fleet. This fleet, which at the outset of the war was in perfect order, was already requiring refits by rotation, with consequent reduction of available strength. Meanwhile, the submarine menace had declared itself in a serious form, and was moreover exaggerated in our minds. Although the most vehement efforts were being made to give security to our fleets in their northern harbors, these measures took many weeks, during which anxiety was continual. Behind all stood the German fleet, aware, as we must suppose, of the strain to which we were being subjected, and potentially ready at any moment to challenge the supreme decision. With the long nights of winter, the absence of all regular troops from the country, the then inadequate training of the territorial force, and the embryonic conditions of the new Kitchener armies, the fear of invasion revived. And although we rejected it in theory, nevertheless we were bound to take in practice a whole series of precautionary measures. It was a formidable time. More than once the thought occurred that the Admiralty would be forced to contract their responsibilities and abandon to their fate for a time some important interests, in order that those which were vital might be secured. In the event, we just got through. It may be claimed that during these months we met every single call that was made upon us, guarded every sea, carried every expedition, brought every convoy safely in, discharged all our obligations both to the army in France and to the Belgians, and all the time maintained such a disposition of our main forces that we should never have declined battle had the enemy ventured to offer it. Then suddenly, all over the world, the tension was relaxed. One after another, the German cruisers and commerce destroyers were blocked in or hunted down. The great convoys arrived. The expeditions were safely landed. Ocean after ocean became clear. The boom defenses of our harbors were completed. A score of measures for coping with the submarine were set on foot. Large reinforcements of new ships of the highest quality and of every class began to join the fleet. The attack on the Suez Canal was stemmed. The rebellion in South Africa was quelled. The dangers of invasion, if such there were, diminished every day with the increasing efficiency of the territorials and the new armies. The great battle for the Channel ports ended in decisive and ever glorious victory. And finally, with the Battle of the Falkland Islands, the clearance of the oceans was complete, and soon, except in the landlocked Baltic and Black Seas, and in the defended area of the Heligoland Bight, the German flag had ceased to fly on any vessel in any quarter of the world. Footnote: the Dresden and 2 armed merchant cruisers were alive for a few weeks more, but in complete inactivity. End of footnote. As December passed, a sense of indescribable relief stole over the Admiralty. We had made the great transition from peace to war without disaster, almost without mishap. All the perils which had haunted us before the war and against which we had prepared had been warded off or surmounted or had never come to pass. There had been no surprise. The fleet was ready, the army had reached the decisive battlefield in time and was satisfactorily maintained. The mine danger had been overcome. We thought we had the measure of the submarine, and so indeed we had for nearly 2 years to come. All the enemy's plans for commerce destruction and all our alarms about them had come to naught. British and Allied commerce proceeded without hesitation throughout the world. The trade and food of Britain were secured. The war insurance dropped to 1%. A feeling of profound thankfulness filled our hearts as this first Christmas of the war approached, and of absolute confidence in final victory. The mighty enemy, with all the advantages of preparation and design, had delivered his onslaught and had everywhere been brought to a standstill. It was our turn now. The initiative had passed to Britain, the great amphibian. The time and the means were at our command. It was for us to say where we would strike and when. The strength of the German fleet was, as we believed, ample. And in addition, the whole of those numerous squadrons, which hitherto had been spread over the outer seas, now formed a surplus fleet capable of intervening in the supreme struggle without in any way compromising the foundation of our naval power. But these realizations were only permissible as the prelude to fresh and still more intense exertions. It would indeed be shameful, so it seemed at least to me, for the Admiralty to rest contented with the accomplishment of the first and most hazardous stage of its task, and to relax into a supine contemplation of regained securities and dangers overcome. Now was the time to make our weight tell, perhaps decisively, but certainly most heavily, in the struggle of the armies. Now was the time to fasten an offensive upon the Germans, unexpected and unforeseeable, to present them with a succession of surprising situations leading on from crisis to crisis and from blow to blow till their downfall was achieved. Moreover, these same Germans were, of all the enemies in the world, the most to be dreaded when pursuing their own plans, the most easily disconcerted when forced to conform to the plans of their antagonists. To leave a German leisure to evolve his vast, patient, accurate designs, to make his slow, thorough, infinitely far-seeing preparations, was to court a terrible danger. To throw him out of his stride, to baffle his studious mind, to break his self-confidence, to cow his spirit, to rupture his schemes by unexpected action, was surely the path not only of glory, but of prudence. Here then ends the first phase of the naval war. The first part of the British task is done, both by land and sea. Paris and the Channel ports are saved, and the oceans are cleared. It is certain that the whole strength of the British Empire can be turned into war power and brought to bear upon the enemy. There is no chance of France being struck down before the British Empire is ready. There is no chance of the British Empire itself being paralyzed before its full force can be applied to the struggle. The supreme initiative passes from the Teutonic powers to the Allies. Resources almost measureless and of indescribable variety in ships, in men, in munitions and devices of war will now flow month by month steadily into our hands. What shall we do with them? Strategic alternatives on the greatest scale and of the highest order present themselves to our choice. Which shall we choose? Shall we use our reinforced fleets and great new armies of 1915 either to turn the Teutonic right in the Baltic or their left in the Black Sea and the Balkans? Or shall we hurl our manhood against sandbags, wire and concrete in frontal attack upon the German fortified lines in France? Shall we, by a supreme effort, make direct contact with our Russian ally, or leave her in a dangerous isolation? Shall we, by decisive action, in hopes of shortening the conflict, marshal and draw in the small nations in the north and in the south, who now stand outside it? Or shall we plod steadily forward at what lies immediately in our front? Shall our armies toil only in the mud of Flanders, or shall we break new ground? Shall our fleets remain contented with the grand and solid results they have won, or shall they ward off future perils by a new inexhaustible audacity? The answers to these momentous questions will appear as this tale is carried forward to a further stage.